Welcome to the Real Math of Business podcast with Alena Bennett. Lovely to be here with you today. Jez and I thought we'd do something a little bit different. Today, as always, it's all very unscripted. But what we thought, this was a nice opportunity to take the top 5 most listened and watched podcasts and just sort of explore some of the not mic drop moments, but explore some of the key points that have come through those in a really interesting way. And I must say, I actually love, for someone who doesn't like watching themselves on stage or listening to them talk, I love listening to these podcasts again, like having the opportunity to listen to them again, because the conversation, even though I'm in the conversation, I actually forget very quickly where the conversation goes. And so, and it's like anything, right? You hear the same thing multiple times and you hear them differently the second, the third, the fourth time, etc. So I'm excited, Jez, that we decided to do this because it gave me the reason to go back to some of these people that, quite honestly, are some of my favorite people in the world, and listen to the what they had to say without having to be present in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for riffing with me today, Jez.
That's all right. And it's a pleasure to be here. So for listeners and viewers, I'm the producer here at Real Math Business with Alena Bennett. And yes, this is a really fun idea because we were kind of tossing around what sort of episode do we want to do this week. And you suggested the top 5 episodes and I looked at them and I was like, what a great selection to talk about. And exactly what you're talking about, I actually get this experience every week when I'm in the podcast producer booth where I'm just listening and hearing the conversation because I'm obviously getting that experience that you're getting on the re-listen live. So I love these conversations and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to get into today's episodes.
Yeah, me too. So what I thought we would do, so the top 5 as it stands mid-May is Edward Podolski, Dr. Kat Page, Richard McBride, Danette Fenton-Menzies, and Jason McDougall. So those are the top 5 in order. And I listened to them all and I kind of captured the sort of key things that I thought would be really fun to talk about and explore further. But actually what I did, so I kind of did that process and wrote my notes and then I went and wrote them down again. And then I went, hang on a second, there's a bit of a grouping. With the themes that I have taken away from them. And how I've grouped these, Jez, and so I'm asking permission to you to play along in this order, is I've kind of grouped Ed and Kat's together, Danette and Jason's together, and then Richard's kind of as the final one because it asks a sort of different type of question. Are you cool to kind of riff in that order?
Let's do it. And you know what? I've also got some clusterings as well, so we can talk about that. So I love this. Let's get started.
Okay. So, I'm distracted because I want to hear your clusters. But let me talk about Ed and Kat. So Ed, look, I think as we've talked about offline before, I love talking with like super duper duper smart people. And of course, being academics, both Ed Podolski and Dr. Kat are both extraordinarily smart. And so I think I enjoy those conversations because I get to learn so much from them. However, what I really loved about Ed, where Ed was able to go, was he talked us through this chain, which is there's reality. Money is a proxy for that reality. We create metrics that drive that money. And then we create these tools that we try to optimize to make the metrics. And it's supposed to have this kind of chain reaction. Now, before we kind of dive a little bit deeper, the other kind of couple of things, I mean, he gave us so much info, but sort of a couple of things that I wanted to pull out is money is a proxy because it's simple. So it's a simple way for us to communicate value. But, and this is one that we kind of, he talked about some examples, but we did kind of gloss over. It's a reflection of a subjective value system. So, you know, quite often we talk in business around numbers being objective. But actually what I heard was that no, it's actually very subjective. And I thought that was so fascinating because I think we forget the reality. So if like in my mind, and would love to kind of, I actually would love to explore this with him because he's obviously expert in this area. But in my mind, I'm like, there's a reality. And fundamentally, and then the next level is money. Money is a proxy, and the inherent flaw in money is that it's a reflection of a subjective value system. Like, means that money is a distortion of reality. And then, so it's a little bit like it gets diluted. So money is diluted. It's a diluted version of reality. And then we create these metrics to try and hit the money targets. That is, those metrics are further diluted, which is what he said. And then we create these tools to optimize for those metrics. Like, there's just so much dilution there. I just think it's so fascinating because until then, like, I was a real believer in the idea of get your lead indicators, focus on the KPIs to get you the lead indicators, because that's going to have that downstream, upstream impact to get to the money, to get to reality. And I guess on reflection, and certainly with the opportunity to listen to that conversation again, like, that's fundamentally blown my mind. And I guess for me, I thought there's an opportunity here. And I think this is an opportunity for senior leaders, but also for the junior burgers in an organisation, even just to have this knowledge, I think is helpful. But I think the senior leaders in the business, yes, they need to do the work to create the metrics, manage and measure the metrics, and create the tools to optimise for their metrics. But they actually, I think they're the ones that need to remember that money is a proxy, which is simply a reflection of a subjective value system. So it's subjective. It's contextual, it's probably biased, and it is also not reality. So I think there are some interesting questions there for the very senior leaders in the business to ask themselves the question, like, what is this really all about? And when we're looking at the money math in our business, what is the reality? When we think about the story of what the numbers tell us, what does the story tell us? And how does that reflect or not? How closely does that reflect or not the reality of what's really going on?
Wow, it's there's so much going on here. I feel like already you can see the value of this podcast, at least in my eyes, because of what you've done here to synthesize a lot of this and bring this in. Because what I'm seeing here is that you're actually giving people a little bit of an insight, a secret insight here. If you kind of distill what you're saying that a lot of people are operating in that second and third and fourth tier, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly, I was the same as you. When I was listening to that podcast, it was kind of like a reality shattering moment where you're like, hold on, wait, where am I living? Like, what's going on? It was kind of like that. Because you're right, because you don't think about it at the level of reality as the source of what then expands out. And so what you've sneakily done here is you've almost said, like, we're understanding that most people operate in those outer rings almost, if you can actually work out what the reality is, you have so much, the ripple effect is so much bigger, even if you can just see it. Even like exactly this conversation right now where we're talking about, you can actually kind of see that reality that then is the thing that gives you such an insight over everybody else. Because it's almost like it's, in my mind, it's almost like a mountain. So it's like, as you're going higher up, you can look kind of down and see a bit more, and you have a bit more visibility, and it's a bit harder to kind of sort of see up. But I mean, who knows, there might even be another layer even in the middle of that we can't see, but this is at least our closest thing where we can start to see some of the outer layers. And so, that's really fascinating, because it's like, I think if you can tap into that, whatever that is, and you can actually see some of the real reality that's within there, that gives you so much of an advantage over everybody else.
And then I'm listening to you talk, and all I can think of is how do you see clearly the reality? How? What is real? And obviously, we're in an age of AI where everyone is asking that question. But if we just kind of assume, let's take AI out of the equation for this part of the conversation and just ask the philosophical question: what is real? How does a group? How does the board and a group of, the senior execs, the C-suite, how do they determine and agree what's real and what's not? Because that's the starting point, right?
It's, this is making me think a little bit, Alena. Tell me what you think about this. But like, you know how people say like follow the money? That seems to me like a little cheat code to be sort of to zip in a little bit to that, at least that money layer of being like, this is closer to reality than some of these other metrics.
Yeah.
So there's probably another element that's a hook like that you could probably think of that gives you that key into reality.
Yeah.
Because because exactly what you're talking about, it's such a distorted field. Like when you try and look into this, it's so complicated to look at because exactly you're trying to look at metrics and you're already 2 steps away from reality. So where do you go from there? Yeah, geez, it's really interesting.
It is, and I wonder maybe then. So, if money is a proxy, I guess maybe the question for those at the very senior level is there a proxy for reality that is closer to, like, for a particular business? And maybe the answer to this is bespoke to each company. But maybe the challenge is, if you know that reality is that, and obviously perception is reality, which means if you've got 10 people around the board and exec, that's 10 different perceptions of the same reality. And then you've got money as the proxy for that reality. The question might be, what is the proxy that sits here? Like, what is the proxy that group of people, is there? And if there is, what is it? Is there a proxy for reality that sits one step closer than the money? Like, that would be an interesting conversation. I don't know what that would sound like. I think it would sound very, as I said, unique to the company. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I think a sort of a metaphor. Maybe you can tell me if you feel like this kind of feels appropriate or not. But this might give us a clue. Hopefully, we'll see. I was just thinking, like, because you're talking about how detached they are from it, like as we start to get out of the rings, there's a sort of level of detachment from reality almost. You're almost living in an alternate reality because of how the metrics have. Like it's not exactly in the sense that it's not obvious what the real reality is. Like it's a sort of distorted thing. And I was thinking it's kind of almost like being like an assistant coach. If you think about the idea of like winning a basketball or whatever sport game, for example, like if you think of the middle part, which would be the reality, is like the goal is to win the game or something. And the next level is like, how do you score a basket or how do you kick a goal or, something. And then you go out and then it's like the next layer would be the players. Then the next layer would be the head coach. And then the next layer would be the assistant coach. And you're sort of like, and again, with the assistant coach, actually, I think that kind of works because they're using a lot of analytics and sometimes those analytics drive performance. And so it kind of feeds back up the chain a little bit. But if you think about it, like in that sense, like, an assistant coach does have an effect on the game and it does have a view like that is a reality, but it's different than the players' reality, obviously, and it's different than the reality of kicking a goal in a specific situation. But each of those kind of gives you closer to the actual objective. But I don't know if there's like such a thing as an objective in this sense, because reality isn't necessarily an objective per se. But yeah, I don't know if that gives us any insights.
It's interesting. I want to actually it's a good segue into Kat's conversation. But I think you're right. I also couldn't help but go to the movie Moneyball because, of course, Jonah Hill's character is looking at numbers that appear nonsensical to everybody else, right? And maybe that is, and I would initially think that those numbers could be further away from the reality, but maybe in that example, they were actually closer than the money. I don't know.
Now you're really tripping me out, Alena. This is really.
I don't know.
No, I like it. It's just making my brain melt now because like the outer ring could give us almost a direct line a bit closer to the reality. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
And I think, but I think maybe that's the call to action for senior leaders is to ask the question. If money, based on the conversation with Ed, if money is a proxy for reality, is there a proxy for your company that you believe is closer than money? Because so many leaders out there say, oh, the numbers are saying this, but this is actually what's going on. I'd love to know then, is there a proxy that sits between money and reality? That would be my sort of call to action for anyone listening to this, based on that synthesis of Ed's conversation. But what I thought was interesting, and I don't think they colluded before the conversations, with the conversation with Kat, there's a couple of things that led up to this point, but Kat, okay. What I loved about Dr. Kat's conversation, so many elements of it, but the point that I wanted to bring up here, so her premise is, instead of thinking that our job is to give people or provide people well-being at work, what if work was the vehicle for well-being for people? Right? I really love that idea. And so we obviously got to a point where we were talking about safety, and she was sharing, we started talking about structure as a safety mechanism. And she was talking very fondly about one of the companies she worked for, Deloitte. And she said, actually, it was very metrics focused, very structured, and there was definitely a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And she said, actually, the structure helped me navigate ambiguity. I knew how to move things through the system. And she contrasted that to being an academic, where there's almost like it's the world is your oyster. And that can be very discombobulating, right? And she also said, for companies that physical safety is, an important metric, she talked about this idea of dominant logic, which actually I really loved that as a phrase, this idea of dominant logic. And she said those companies that have a dominant logic where 1 + 1 = 2, that works really well in a physical safety capacity because it's very obvious. You do this and you do this and we're safe. Great. She said, when we're talking about psychosocial safety, that dominant logic is harder to define. And actually, she talked about, I'm just going to go to my notes. I got it on she talks about dominant logic is the beliefs, assumptions, or stories that most strongly hold in an organization, right? Coming back to, so then you go, if dominant logic is about the behaviours that sort of naturally exist in an organisation, that behaviour is often shaped by metrics. And she said so then she contrasted, yes, structure helps to navigate ambiguity, but if there are too many metrics, there is no space to think and people start to behave to achieve the metrics. And then she said, and this is the link, metrics are supposed to be a proxy for a quality outcome. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, right? Because we've now gone, if we come back to Ed's, money is a proxy for reality. Metrics then go to Kat. Metrics is the metrics, which is to deliver the numbers. Metrics is supposed to be for a quality outcome. And then she said sometimes in overly structured businesses, they behave to achieve the metric. And I just thought it was really interesting talking to two academic experts that they both had this knowledge of things being proxies for other things. I don't know. I can tell that your brain's exploding, so I'm going to pause right now because you've obviously got something to say.
No, I was just going to, I love, again, I love how you've connected these because this was not how I connected them at all, but I love how you've synced these up because what you're actually kind of showing is like, you're talking about the framing of each of these being a different way that almost reality can be distorted, but what you're also saying is it can also be at each of these stages like almost focused. So each of these doesn't necessarily have to be a distortion field. It can actually, each of them, if they're correctly managed, can give us a better indicator into reality. But at each point, it's like a hinge. So like, at each stage, it could go wrong,
Yep.
And so I hadn't thought about it like this, but as you're sort of talking about this and how like it can be good or bad, each stage, each deviation from it gives you another way that you can be wrong or right,
And look, we haven't talked about duality recently, but the idea of duality did actually, you've just reminded me, the idea of duality did actually come up in the conversation with Kat. We talked about well-being and fear. I think we talked about love and grief. And so we kind of said you kind of need one to have the other. And so I'm just listening to what you're saying and saying, actually, the law of duality would suggest that absolutely at each level that you go, there's a helpful way and an unhelpful way that this can work. And yes, and you're right, both Ed and Dr. Kat were in their own way telling us that. And I love thinking about the real math of business, or the people challenge within the real math of business, is how ambition operates under constraint. Because we know without constraint, everyone's happy days, everyone's working, in the best way possible, everyone's their best selves, and we're all singing Kumbaya and delivering awesome things, right? But that's not the reality on how people behave under constraint. And so I loved Kat's stories around how structure can help, because structure is what creates constraint, right? So you go, we've all felt like a square peg in a round hole before. The structure has felt like, it's like getting into a pair of jeans or trying on a wetsuit, right? It's really, really uncomfortable. Structure can feel that way. But at the same time, structure gives you, okay, I can play around in this sandbox because I know I can see all of the edges, so I know not to go beyond the edges. And actually, Kat talked about it's about finding the edge.
Wow. This is really, it's so interesting because I think, the real math of business is such an interesting philosophical problem. You're right. Each time you sort of walk into one direction, there's some weird mystery that pops up, as part of this. And it feels, I don't know if you're feeling like this, but as you're talking about this, it's making me feel like there's an element of paradox to it. Like each time you try and go, like exactly what you're saying there's an element of you've created a box, and that's where you have some safety in a weird way that you would think that would create unsafety because you're like, I'm trapped. But it's not like that.
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
do you think?
And it's funny. I'll very quickly, before we move on to Jason and Danette, it's reminding me a girlfriend just went on an Intrepid tour, like a tour group, to Vietnam. She said it was incredible. But when she first told me, I was like, oh, who does tour groups anymore? Like that was like a Kentucky thing when we were 18, right? And she said, actually, no, it's brilliant because it was an Intrepid group for families with teens.
Mm-hmm.
So there was the safety of knowing that she would, her and her husband would not be going on this holiday with like 20-year-old young adults without kids that wanted to just party. So that was good. But also she wouldn't have to hang around with like screaming young babies, right? And grey nomads. So there was a lot of safety in knowing, we're going to hang around with people in the similar stages of life, and also the safety of a tour group where someone does all the planning and had created in the tour enough space for them to have their own time as well.
Wow. Yeah, such an interesting thing to bring up now. An Intrepid tour when we're talking about like the layers of reality and money, but it's so true. Because it's like, you're exactly right. I thought the same thing when you said a tour group, but you're so right. For that specific circumstance, it makes everything easier and probably better. I'm sure they probably got a friend or two that's come out of it as well or something,
Their 14-year-old got a girlfriend. Very cute.
So that's incredible. Like wow. How interesting.
Yeah, so interesting. So yes, so that was kind of how and why I grouped Ed and Kat together, because I thought it was so interesting that they both talked about, I think Ed gave us kind of the ingredients to some sort of formula or flow chart, and then inherently Kat's, she used the same word, proxy, and she talked about behavior, metric being a proxy for outcomes, and behavior sometimes being forced to deliver the metrics, and how that operates in a construct of constraint or not. And so I just thought that was so interesting because, of course, we don't script any of our podcasts and we don't give them questions and they don't talk to each other first. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, actually, Alena, just quickly before we go, because I think that this is just like, can we just get a sort of last look at this? Because I mean, this is such a, it's a kind of very theoretical conversation, but I think if you're following this conversation, it's very interesting. And I feel like you're getting a little bit of an insight because it's, you got two academics telling you this is kind of how we're looking at the whole situation.
Yes.
But how has it like changed how you view business or even just sort of day-to-day things?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do need to make it useful as well as interesting. So there's this saying that we talk about in the land of CFOs where we need to tell the story behind the numbers. And so for me, I think both of those conversations challenge the depth of that phrase. That yes, you do need to tell the story behind the numbers, but actually it's and I've always talked about my fascination for the numbers that aren't there. And I think if we tell the story behind the numbers and the story behind the numbers that aren't there, it's probably a combination of those two that get us to reality. So I think it's tell the story of reality through the numbers, but be clear that the numbers are the right representation, because we know through both conversations that numbers are subjective, and that as we get further away from reality through the different layers of numbers, metrics, and tools, there's a level of distortion. So we get further away from the truth. So which numbers are you using and how far away from the truth are they? And then thinking then about how are those metrics deriving not only the real reality, but are they driving the quality outcome, not just an outcome? Are they driving the quality outcome? So for me, I guess, if you're in a position where you have to tell the story behind the numbers, if you're being asked to understand the story behind the numbers, or if you are responsible for producing, like doing the work that creates the numbers or making decisions based on those numbers, I would be asking the question, how do the numbers reflect reality? I would be asking the question, are our metrics driving the right behaviours to create the quality outcome? And I would be asking ourselves the question, what are the mechanisms that we have in place to reconcile reality to money, metrics to reality, and tools to reality? Those are the practical questions that I would be asking, because fundamentally, telling the story behind the numbers is still the right action. But I think what we've learned is that there are depths to that. Like there are ways to further validate if the story we're telling is the real story or a story that is a little bit more divorced from the truth because of these layers that we've just learned about.
Wow. That's it's so interesting and it's so complicated. I love this, but yeah, wow. It's such an interesting way to think about this whole problem, because it's such a deep way to look at it.
It is. And what I find for having worked a very long time in finance and with CFOs, they're looking for ways to create more meaning in their work. They actually don't, like, some people love the safety of a spreadsheet, and myself too at times. It's, it's very safe. There's a lot of structure. But people are looking for more meaning in their work. And so I think, yes, this is all very interesting and it's quite philosophical, but I tell you what, I reckon the opportunity is more interesting. It gets you closer to what the business is all about.
And in that way, almost a way to see reality.
Yeah.
If you can do it right. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
I know, right?
Well, my mind's already been blown, but we've got to get to some of our other top 5 here, Alena. So let's chat about some of the other conversations. Let's talk about some of your other clusters here.
Yeah. So my other cluster was Danette and Jason. And the thing that I noticed that came up through both of those conversations was the time paradigm, or the time paradox. Short-term, long-term. I'll start with Jason. So Jason he made this, and I'm just reading from my notes because I wanted to quote this. He asked the question, he told a story, which was a very inspiring story. And he made the statement, really what that's about, it's about asking ourselves the question, when we get to the end of ourselves, what is left? So when we kind of get to that point of complete, like, surrender, despair, I got nothing. Like, we've all experienced that. I got nothing, right? And so in his story and in his own personal experience, he turns to God. So what is left? You turn to God. Some people go to God, some people go to meditation, some people go to other forms of faith and spirituality. But I really found this question so powerful. When we get to the end of ourselves, what is left? And to me, that really linked up with his idea of ownership versus stewardship, which was, ownership. And again, he kind of shifted my paradigm, because I was like, oh gosh, if everyone just treated their business as their own, they'd have more skin in the game, so they would do more and all the rest of it. And he said, well, actually, no, because when things go bad, it all becomes about themselves, and people go into silos and they make bad decisions and all of those things. And actually, at some point that combusts or self-combusts. And so actually, if we remove ourselves from the equation and think of ourselves as stewards, we can detach from the emotion of, oh, this is all my problem, this is all on me, which is a very ego-driven thought, by the way, and think, okay, if it's not about me, who is it about? Well, it's about our customers, it's about our community, it's about our staff. So that there's obviously a lot of, pressure that comes with that responsibility, but there's also a safety of, my business manager that worked with me, she was having trouble getting me to do things. And she said, Alena, the thing is, you'll never cancel on a client, but you'll cancel on yourself all the time. And I think that comes from a deep sense of responsibility for others. And I think that's what Jason was saying, is if you move into the stewardship model, you will never not show up for others. And so it will allow you to open your brain. You're taking the pressure off and you're going, okay, it's not about me anymore. How do I make this work for the others in my ecosystem? And so where we then talked about the long-term, short-term, we talked with Jason, we talked about, the short-term being about the dividend. How much can I take out of the business to afford my lifestyle, versus steward, which is not about me taking a dividend. It's how do I make sure that this business is around for a long time and a good time, and it serves the people it's designed to serve. Which, if I then pivot to Danette's conversation, because she works with a lot with family businesses, those family businesses are thinking in generations. They don't think in quarters, they don't think in years, they think in generations. And inherently, that means you're thinking long term. Now, so I'm really grouping these two conversations together, because then Danette, and I know this about Danette because she's one of my closest friends and I respect her brain greatly. She then talks about how she has this love of brain science. And she really, like, the kind of through line through all of her work is, how do we work with our brain, not against our brain? Part of my interpretation was, when we are in that position where we're going, do I make the short-term decision or the long-term decision? What we're actually avoiding is a difficult conversation with someone. And so she does a lot of work trying to help these families and other businesses navigate difficult conversations. And so that's when she leans on the brain science and says, well, when we're in a difficult conversation situation and we're thinking about the short term, our brain gets smaller. We're not able to harness the best of our brain. So we are fundamentally working against our brain to try and push an outcome. When you're thinking long term, you're actually making better decisions because you're making the holistic decision that may result in a short-term dip in whatever way for long-term gain. You're not going to make an unethical decision in the short term because you're focused on the long term. And so I just, for both of those, I think, because I do think, coming back to what I said before, about this idea of how ambition behaves under constraint, sometimes that constraint, frequently, should I say, that constraint is the constraint of time. Dan Sullivan, who's one of the best coaches for entrepreneurs, he runs a program called Strategic Coach, which I've had the privilege of being in. He talks about it's not the goals that, and I'm paraphrasing dreadfully, but he basically says it's not the goals that cripple entrepreneurs. It's not the size of the goals that cripple entrepreneurs. It's the timelines. I mean, think about that, right? So if you're in a business and you've got an amazing product that delivers real value to the world, and you know that it's going to make, let's say, $1 billion, that is a likely accurate hypothesis. Right? If you're talking of numbers of that magnitude, you're probably right. So imagine you were able to just build to that point of $1 billion, like that's all really good. Then someone says, well, you don't have your own time frame. You've got to do it in my time frame. That's where things start to go a bit pear-shaped and you go into that fear state or fright state, however that manifests for you. And then you're going, oh, this feels hard. What shortcuts do I need to make? Who do I need to lay off, or who do I need to push to the brink of burnout? And it's all quite self-centered.
Wow. I think sorry, did you want to?
No.
Sorry, I think you've given me a bit of an insight as to, because this actually to me ties back to our last conversation about the hinges of the different layers of reality a little bit. In that what you're showing us a bit of a hinge, I think, in some ways, which is, if we think of money as the distortion of reality, and we're talking about metrics and how some metrics don't help and some metrics do help and some metrics don't exist that would help, and we think about why, like, what I'm thinking when you're saying all this is that there is the short term versus long term is the distortion field in some ways. Because, like, do you know what I mean? Like, in the sense that, like, if I'm trying, like, if the money is the second layer off and then the metrics are the third layer off, it's like some metrics are designed to help make the short-term decisions a better decision or something. I don't know. You can probably speak to this better. I don't work with CFOs or something. But like, I think you're showing at least a way that a distortion can happen between that reality is you add in an objective that maybe disaligned with what you're talking about, that longer term timeline or something.
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. And this is why I love our debriefs after you're absolutely right, because we put in metrics and tools. Let's say you roll out a system and that system is going to take 3 years woe to go. Not many people have the patience or resilience to work on a project for 3 years without a little dopamine hit and the endorphins that kind of get you along the way. So that's why we put in milestones and metrics, is to help us, give us the short-term dopamine hit so that we stay the course for 3 years. Like, I have no patience or resilience. I am like what they call I'm a quick start, not a finisher, right? And that's using Colby language. So I definitely need the short-term things to keep me going for the long term. I actually know better. I just hire people that know how to do the finishing for me. But you're absolutely right. So yes, the time can distort things, because if the metrics are designed to carve up for this example, the 3-year project into a weekly timeline, for example. That's a huge distortion, right? Like, how do you know what are your checkpoints in there? Because what's a weekly checkpoint? There are 52 weeks in a year times 3 is what? 156, let's say. I might have done that maths wrong. So you've got 156 of these weekly metrics that you're measuring, but you would need to have other metrics to ensure that at the quarter, at the 6 month, whatever the time horizons are where things could, because we know that every week is a distortion. And every distortion can drive good behavior or bad behavior. So it's like, what are the checkpoints you've got in place to make sure that it actually truly builds to the 3-year, takes you to Sydney and not Auckland if you're aiming for Sydney? Yeah, I'm just mixing metaphors big time here, but you know what I mean, I think.
Yeah. And this is so interesting, because I don't know if you're getting this as well. This is also feeling like it's tying back to that first thing, because when you were talking about the Deloitte, and then talking about sort of what Jason was talking about, I think the word that comes up is purpose a little bit.
Yes,
and so
a lot about
purpose.
and
purpose. And I'm wondering now that we're talking about this distortion, is it's like, if the company, if there's some element that the purpose feels like short-term profits, maybe that has some like knock-on effects to those other layers or something with, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's something in there, because one of the things, coming back to Dr. Kat's conversation, is she talked about this idea of dominant logic, and I'll come back to how she described it again. She said dominant logic, beliefs, assumptions, or stories that most strongly hold in an organization, otherwise known as culture. And we talked about the fact you can feel culture. So we can say a purpose and we can feel a purpose, but we can also feel if the purpose is actually about money, not the real purpose.
Wow. And so, wow, I don't know if this is what you're feeling, but I'm feeling like you and I at the moment, this conversation is kind of pinging back and forth between the reality and some of the metrics. And it's like we're sort of looking, you and I are sort of getting like glances at what some of the reality is by seeing how these things are operating by. It's like hard to see what the actual picture is, but you're getting like
Correct.
little responses back almost, you know?
Well, yes. And I think to be really clear for anyone that has stuck around for this long and is listening to this conversation, A, thank you. But B, I didn't set out to try and cluster them. Like I didn't set out to go, oh, let me see what sense I can make out of 5 disparate conversations. This is just sort of, I'm riffing and, you know, as you can probably tell, Jez and I are making these connections up on the spot. So I think, yes, you're right. It's interesting that we do seem to be pinging back and forth and somehow there is this interrelationship. And I guess what I will just say, as I've said in several of the podcasts, is I don't have an answer. I don't have the answer. I don't have a prescription. What I believe is the real math of business is fundamentally different for every business. And I think what we're showing or what we're attempting to show is there are different ways to look at this. And it's every person's job to go, oh, that could be useful for my company. I'm going to take that bit. And that bit's not going to be useful. So I'm just going to ignore that bit. Because I think otherwise, if you were like you and I, our brains are exploding at this moment. But I think, and so that if you said, I need to take everything that Alena and Jez have said in this conversation and apply it, I don't think that would be helpful. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Alena, did you want to talk about Richard's?
Yes,
Richard, and how that sort of expands into into these sort of 5.
Well, to me, what I felt was one of the through lines through Richard's conversation. Richard, I would say, is the granddaddy of CFO community in Australia and New Zealand, right? And so he has seen in the 20 years that he's been in business, really seen the role of the CFO change. And it's changed from really numbers heavy to more people heavy. So his metric was really interesting. He said 20 years ago, math 70, people 30, and now people 70, math 30. So for me, when I was looking at when I was re-listening to all of these conversations and thinking like what would be a useful perspective to kind of share in this episode, because that conversation was so focused on CFOs, naturally my question was, if you're listening to this, now that you've got the knowledge from Richard's podcast, that is, the role has grown significantly. My question to people listening to this would be, are you optimizing your CFO effectively? Given the change, like, did you hire a numbers CFO? And are you still just using them for numbers? Did you hire a numbers CFO and do you have an opportunity to grow them into a more people-centric CFO? Did you hire a people CFO and you need them? Like, are you using your CFO? Our CFO used to be able to do this for us. Now it can do this. So have you thought about your leadership structure, knowing that you now have an asset that used to be this, that is now this? So are you optimizing that asset? But also, what is the then ripple effect to the other executives in your business? So then it made me think, and because I work less with other C-suite in the business, I don't have that same level of intimate knowledge. What are the other C roles in the business that have changed equally as much? Now, it's probably fair to say that many of the C-suite roles that exist now did not exist 20 years ago. Chief Experience Officer, Chief Data Officer. So we probably always had a Chief Information Officer, but now we've got, are we talking CIO, CTO or CDO, right? So my question is, do you have other roles in the business that have changed so much? So have you done, if you're the CEO listening to this or even the board, have you zoomed out enough to go, who do we have in the exec? Like, what roles do we have, and what are they doing? Could they be doing more?
Mm-hmm.
Could they be doing better? And then what does that then mean for your jigsaw of the executive team?
Mm.
So I think that kind of sits above. It's a little bit more of a role-related question. But if we think about this concept of the real math of business, it is so interdependent on perspectives and people that for me, I kind of thought about Richard's conversation and went, actually, that the question around who you've got sitting around that is trying to practice the real math of business. Yes, it's the CFO, but it's every other C-suite as well. Taking what we learned from Richard about the evolution of the role of the CFO, what does that mean for the evolution of other roles? And if you're a CEO or board listening to this, do you have the right structure for what you need right now?
Yeah.
That was kind of the thing that came to me.
That's great. And so, like, this is why I think this podcast is great, because your brain is able to go like, here's a big lesson that we've just taken from here. What does that mean for all these other things that surround, like, are in close proximity to that? Because even as you're saying, like, even as that role has had to change, that's going to mean other people's roles had to sort of change in some way. So yeah, wow, that's really fascinating. Like, it's such an interesting way to like take that and then just expand it out and go, now you can use this almost as a lens to look at these things and go, how do I approach it from that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, if we say that the real math of business is maths and people, it would be easy to say, oh, well, as the CEO, I really just need a finance person because I can take care of the people and I just need my CFO. But that's not how CFOs operate anymore. It's fundamentally different. And so I think that's a real opportunity for all companies to say, what have we got? What do we need? And then who do we need? And actually, when I was re-listening to that one, it made me think about the podcast with Bill Withers, because Bill talked about the way, so he's the expert in SMEs. He talked about role clarity as being critical in growing and scaling SMEs. And he talked about defining the roles, and then if you need to, grouping the roles, and then asking yourself, who do I need in those roles? And I think that's a useful check for any business. What are the roles that I need in my company today and for tomorrow? How would I group them if there's a natural grouping? And then who do I need? Like, what is the type of person I need to fill those roles? So that was kind of the adjacent conversation that made me think more broadly about Richard's conversation.
Yeah, I love that. That's, again, you're just adding a layer of depth to how you can think about that role. It's not as almost simple as it used to be. You're saying it's become a lot more complicated with elements that you still had to be good at back in the day, but you've got to add these additional sort of ones to expand the role. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, Alena, I just thought I'd share my clusterings here, just because because I think this is interesting. So my clusterings, I actually sort of mostly, I had Richard's as kind of separate, but I had everyone else in one kind of group as well. So I had Richard's, but I had everyone else connected in a slightly different way.
Okay.
So for me, mine was looking at how each of them talks about how kind of integrated, at least in the conversation, how diversity is important in this. So just to quickly run through it, Dr. Kat Page was talking about the power of community, especially in stuff around finance, which was kind of fascinating. But that was an interesting topic. She's like, no one can be an expert on everything. It's good to have all these different perspectives. And then when I was thinking about chatting with Edward Podolski, and we're talking about innovation and the inefficiency of greatness.
Yes.
It's like you need to, in that way, it was about, in my mind, embracing sort of the wastage, and that is going to produce a lot of sort of like not useless perspective, but just useless stuff that doesn't need to be used. And in that way, it's a less homogenized way of thinking. It's just like we want it to be kind of out of the box, but we want a lot of different perspectives. With Danette, again, it's interesting in a conversation about family business where you'd think that having an aligned thought process is kind of the idea. Diversity is actually one of the most important things, because otherwise it's too stuck it
Yes.
needs to be able to adapt with the times. So you need different opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And with Jason, even though, I'm not necessarily religious, I thought he approached the conversation really nicely through that lens. And it was his thing was, I think it was very open to a lot of different interpretations as well. It's like, this
Yes.
is just my particular pathway. But, at the end of the day, that I actually took the exact same note that you're talking about, that stewardship, ownership to stewardship thing.
Mm.
And sort of no matter who you are, even if it's just like the thing that's bigger than you is just humanity or Earth or
Yeah.
whatever, you can always find a purpose in that kind of way. And that was kind of a takeaway of like, there's so many different ways to look at this problem, but each of them kind of have the
Yes.
same idea. And so, and then the interesting thing was with Richard, the funny thing almost was that the opposite is true. Though I think in some ways, it proves that they should be talked about more. But he was talking about how one of the problems with CFOs is almost all of them really don't want the acclaim. They all want to sit in the background. He was talking about when
Mm.
people are like going for awards, CEOs and stuff
Yeah.
always are like going for it, but the CFOs, you have to kind of really drag them in.
Yes.
And which is kind of an interesting hegemonic thing in when I'm talking about diversity and the other thing. But I suppose in some ways that's also a failure of us to sort of like, I guess, encourage the voice of those people, because they're people that are not naturally inclined to get their voice out there. So it's like a sort of failure in that kind of perspective to integrate that kind of different lens. So yeah, that was kind of my sort of more of my clustering. But I thought, that was kind of how I looked at it.
I love that you drew that out, because the minute you said diversity, I was like, oh, yeah, we definitely talked about that topic actually explicitly in many of those conversations. And I think, look, it's a whole nother conversation about diversity. I think what's interesting about what you've drawn out, though, is that diversity is one of those things we all know we want, and we know at a rational level drives better decisions, yet we don't when under constraint. So if we come back to this idea of constraint, what do we do? Well, if it's a time constraint or pressure to deliver a certain result, well, we're not going to go and seek diverse opinions, are we? We're going to go and seek those opinions that will give us the result in that constraint. And that's where things go wrong. And so it's possible then the overlay that you are providing for us, Jez, and that the challenge might be okay, let me come back to what you said before about time. Is diversity another distortion? Like the question that's going through my head is, we kind of talked about this flow that Edward gave us, and we talked about kind of the hinges, and then you said, well, it kind of feels like time could be one of those hinges that creates distortion. The question that's going through my mind now is, Maybe diversity is not a distortion, but diversity or lack of diversity is a symptom when we're in the unhelpful distortion. And so maybe it's just simply, if you're at risk of an unhelpful distortion, how could diversity help you get onto the right path?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I think that's, again, like what I'm talking about, where you're pinging back off reality. This is like a thing where it's like you're talking about an effect of a time constraint changes almost the reality of the situation, because you're right. It's like in a really short time pressure, you don't want a lot of ideas. You kind of want one to just run with.
Correct.
And so, yeah, having that different opinion is going to, in that way, create a distortion field if your goal is to finish something on time. But like in a very short time period. But if you have different goals, if they're all these ones that we're talking about, longer term thing, then it's an advantage, because it gives you more options to play with and then to choose a pathway. So it's like, it's interesting, because like that's like a sort of downstream upstream sort of ping back and forth between the metrics, like and the reality of the situation, and how that affects, like it goes back and forth almost.
Well, and I guess this is the whole point. This is the whole diversity argument, is fundamentally the reality is always going to be diverse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Reality is not a homogenous population thing, right? And so that's always been the argument of diversity. Yeah. So I actually really love that you drew that out of those.
Well, I think you connected it. So I have to say, one thing I've really liked about this conversation is I think it's shown how this conversation may look at something, and we're looking at maths and people, but it's fundamentally we're looking at something a lot deeper. This is a lens that we're using to enter a conversation that's, at the end of the day, we're talking about what is reality, through this conversation. But it's because that conversation affects every other layer of this, and those are where most of our other conversations are happening. Like, not every conversation has to go to this level of depth, but having this little insight about it gives us another way to look at those other conversations, at least in my opinion.
No, I think you're right, because and I'll come back to what Edward said, which is money is just a proxy for reality. And I think, this conversation has just showcased the complexity of that. But I think the kind of synthesis of it all would be, don't get lost in the complexity. Just remember that all of this is just trying to be some sort of representation of reality. So the closer to reality, the more you understand the reality, the easier everything else will be.
Yeah. Wow. What a place. I think that's a great place to leave people. Mic drop moment. Alena, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. This was a great chat. I feel like we got to really talk about some of the the top 5 episodes that people have watched the most, but we also really got to explore some of the fundamental questions of what this podcast is about, and really explore some of the different ideas that we like to talk about.
I love it. Thanks, Jez, for playing along. I mean, as I said, I always love our debriefs at the end of the conversation. So it was good to be able to actually have the space to do that well. I'm so grateful for you and for all of the contributions of all of our guests. This podcast would be nothing without it. So thank you. Thanks so much for listening to The Real Math of Business. I hope you have found this synthesis helpful. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to stay on top of The Real Math of Business. I've been Alena. He's been Jez. Thanks so much for listening.